We are live now.
Yes, we are. We can start.
Okay. Over to you, Elisa.
Okay, a very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our speakers and participants from all over the globe. Also, good day to our technical team and my co-chair, Rajendra Kumar. This session is live streamed on YouTube and will be recorded. Welcome to all to the World Planning Congress, organized and hosted by ISOCARP and with co-hosts UN Habitat and the Urban Economic Forum. Today's session has been organized in cooperation with UN Habitat. And for those who don't know ISOCARP so well, it is the International Society of City and Regional Planners, founded in 1965, a global association of professional urban and regional planners. Our network brings together both individual and institutional members from more than 85 countries who work both in public, private, and non-profit sectors. Before we kickstart, and we have a great agenda and fantastic speakers, a few housekeeping rules for the audience. So please mute yourself for the whole session. However, you are very much encouraged to comment, give feedback, and post questions, both on the chat in Zoom and also via YouTube. So once more, the session is recorded live and can also be watched afterwards. I'm one of your co-hosts for this session and co-chair of track 6 of the World Planning Congress, which is Healthy and Inclusive Urban Environments. My name is Elisabeth Belpaire. I'm an urban and regional planning advisor, worked across the world, and I'm now based in Geneva area. Over to you, Rajendra.
Thank you so much, Elisabeth. Very good morning, very good afternoon, and very good evening to all present here and all the live audiences who are joining us from across the globe. I am Rajendra Kumar. I'm an architect and urban planner based in New Delhi, India. I'm director of School of Architecture, Noida International University. With my colleague Elisabeth, I am your co-chair. We are going to have a very interesting discussion about COVID and our cities. As Elisa has rightly mentioned about that, ISOCARP, International Society of City and Regional Planners, based out of in Netherlands, having a member across the globe. We are one of the largest network of planners. In this session, which is in collaboration with UN Habitat, we are going to have a very useful deliberation talking about cities and talking about the threat of COVID, how the COVID is going to change our life and our cities. 2020 had been a very tough time for all human mankind across the globe. By finishing 2020 December, we are hoping to have a good news from the beginning of next year. When I'm saying good news, I'm basically talking about vaccination. I would like to acknowledge the presence of very eminent speaker, Herman from UN Habitat, Antara from UN, Deputy Mayor Ms. Anuela Ristani, Mayor from Africa, Ambassador Her Excellency Melba Pria, and Jaya Dinshaw from WRI, Stefano Boeri from Milan. Over to you, Elisabeth. I would request you to just give a very brief introduction of our speaker, and then before we go for first presentation by our first speaker, Herman.
Okay. So yes, the track on healthy and inclusive environments could not be more relevant today, and the special COVID session neither. Considered the biggest health crisis of this century, and even before the pandemic hit the regions and the world, we received an overwhelming response to this track, indicating that health, well-being, and inclusion are important for planners and authors of other disciplines as well. And that's a good sign. It should indeed be on top of our agenda, especially since health of people and planet are intertwined, and we cannot have health for people and planet if there is no equity. So these are important ingredients of the discussion today. This COVID pandemic has transformed the way in how we live our lives across the world. Significant and long-lasting repercussions will be felt across societies and for a long time to come. As UN Secretary General has stated, along with the great challenges to humanity, this pandemic represents as well an enormous opportunity to rethink how regions, cities, neighborhoods, and buildings are being planned, designed, and built. Policymakers, designers are now confronted with the need to both revisit the efficiency and effectiveness and equitability of present city forms and systems, and redefine tools and collaboration mechanisms to sustainably support cities and their transition towards higher levels of resilience and a green and just city. So I would like to introduce our set of speakers and then hand over to the first keynote. The first keynote will be delivered by Herman, Pienaar and Antara Tandon. Herman is lead of the UN Habitat Urban Lab, senior program manager, assisting cities and government with innovative approaches to achieve sustainable development outcomes. And Antara is also architect, urban planner in the Urban Lab of UN Habitat. So they will for us report on a global survey on cities and pandemics with a major focus on the spatial aspects, the dynamics and patterns. So the floor is to you, Herman.
Before Herman start, I would just like to acknowledge the presence of our President, Martin Dublik. He's with us.
Good day. Can you hear me? Great.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Good day. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to speak here at this very relevant topic at this time in the ISOCARP conference. It's a great privilege to be able to share some of the results that we got from studies that we've done. In terms of the presentation that I'll deliver, it's really a paper that's been done in terms of the spatial patterns and dynamic in relation to the pandemic. And this is part of a broader series of papers that will be produced and published by UN Habitat in the beginning of next year, early next year, that deals with the future state of cities in a world with pandemics. The other three aspects that are being dealt with in the complete paper will be governance, inequality, and economic and finance. And as has been indicated, we're dealing with more the morphological and spatial indications of the pandemic. And it's really trying to create the evidence base to create a better understanding of what the consequences of the pandemic is. How can we become more resilient in the future and enable better decision making and create more resilient cities for the future? The outline of the presentation is really a brief outline of the paper and how it is structured. And then we are going to go through a scalar kind of approach of looking at the territorial systems at a regional scale, then a city scale, and then I'll hand over to Antara to take us through the neighborhood scale, building scale, and to do the concluding remarks. So what we're trying to achieve is to examine the relationship between COVID and urban form and reflect on the possibilities of reimagining the city and its health for multiple territorial scales. It really looks at what are the evidence that we have at the moment, and it's not conclusive evidence. We're still in the midst of a pandemic, but it is what we could learn from where we currently are, and then look at what possibilities and opportunities does it give us to change cities and the way that urban systems could function in the future, and really provide the evidence for future decision making and to bring in health in cities as a key dimension for urban planning. The paper is organized along these different scales, basically looking at the territorial and regional side, the city scale, neighborhood scale, and then the building scale. But in each of these, we were looking at what are the pre-existing conditions for the pandemic, what are the immediate measures, but we really concentrate on the medium and long-term actions and the lessons that we could learn from where we are currently. The different areas or issues that's been raised are reflected in the slide. I'm not going to go through each one of them, but it will deal with this. These are obviously interlinked and not strictly speaking allocated only to the territorial or only to the city scale. They are cross scalar, but we organize them in terms of where we think that they would have the greatest effect and where the decision making can take place. So at the territorial and regional level, I think climate change and environmental systems is a really big issue that's been elevated within this pandemic. And I'm going to read the quote to say that the world needs to demonstrate the same unity and commitment to climate action and cutting greenhouse gas emissions as to containing the coronavirus pandemic. Failure in climate change mitigation could lead to greater human life and economic losses during the coming decades. And there's a really good intersect between the issues and areas that we need to handle because of the pandemic and climate change as such. The environmental systems is one of the key issues that came out that needs to be managed, and there are two aspects here. The one is really related to the loss of biodiversity and of habitat on the one hand, due to either farming practices or destruction of forests. And the other is really uncontrolled urbanization and infringement on natural systems with urban development. And both of those brings us into closer contact with between humans and animals. And the risk, it heightens the risk of zoonotic diseases and the spread of diseases and future pandemics. So the notion is really that at this scale, we need to adopt environmental protection measures, make sure that we establish clear protected areas for natural habitat and protect wider ecosystems, and that we also restore habitats and reintegrate natural habitats into the urban system as part of a link with nature, and also to create better air quality, which is really the next issue that came up. Air quality emerged as a key precondition for contagion and especially for the mortality rate in cities. Now, it doesn't have a direct effect on the spread of the pandemic, but it creates medical preconditions like lung diseases and so forth that then makes those populations very vulnerable to pandemics like this. So limiting the atmospheric and environmental pollution can make a huge contribution to resilience of cities, and it's something that can be dealt with at both the city and at the regional scale. So planning for a decrease in air pollution by just switching more and more from a car-based transportation to more non-motorized transportation, one can see that it would have a major effect within cities, but also to address the pollution at a regional level and deal with air pollution that are created either through agricultural practices or power generation as well. The one thing that came out in terms of the constraints that COVID has put on societies in terms of the ability to move around and lockdown situations is that we've seen the major effect that it has on cities and on the amount of air pollution. And this provides a great opportunity for cities and for regions to go forward and implement some of these measures and create the circumstances for instance, for remote working to continue in the future. The next issue at a regional scale really deals with the connectivity and the network of cities. We know that especially at the initial phases of the pandemic, that the major cities and the best interconnected cities bore the brunt of the spread of the disease. There was no real surprises there, but gradually, as the disease progressed, it started to spread to minor cities and also to rural areas. And what has come out is that the regions that are more balanced, that have got a better spread of facilities, especially things like health facilities, were able to cope better with dealing with the pandemic. So the lesson to learn is really to say we need to strengthen a more closer regional and urban link, and make sure that we expand regional infrastructure in terms of creating a better balanced network of cities and regions. What also came out because of the remote working situation is an opportunity for smaller cities to attract some of the high value individuals, because they don't need the proximity of being in major cities all the time. And it is a trend that has been evident before the pandemic, but with the evident rise of the technology, we anticipate that it will be a trend that will be strengthened in future, but also provides an opportunity to balance regional development in a better way. Agricultural and food systems were also one of the critical areas that came out within the pandemic, especially in terms of food security and the ability for food distribution within urban and rural areas. And in that respect, we should embrace the localization of production and to shorten the supply chains, especially of the food industry, and to make sure that we integrate the logistics and value chain of food from production right through to market within our planning to ensure that those systems are robust and can deal and function within situations of pandemics. That's at the regional scale, the main issues that came out. At a city scale, the main issue that probably came out at city scale was the equitable access to basic services. And we found that this is one of the areas that not only in terms of the spreading of the virus, but in terms of responding to the virus, became a critical issue in terms of being able to respond adequately and to apply the measures required for social distancing and so forth. So cities with more equitable distribution of services were less vulnerable than cities that weren't equitable in terms of their distribution, and therefore the advice is really to prioritize investments to ensure that adequate basic services are available across the city and equitable access to all people within the city to create a more resilient urban system. In terms of urban form and function, we know that the larger cities and the more connected cities were more susceptible to the virus, but over the longer term, these cities weren't necessarily more vulnerable than some of the sub and second tier and third tier cities, and even some rural areas as the virus spread initially. Initially, the density was cited as a major issue within cities and as a negative issue. The evidence suggests the contrary to that. Density was not a deciding factor in the infection. If we look at the maps on the right-hand side of New York, the top map looks at where the most dense areas are within the city, and the bottom map looks at where the infection rate were the highest. So you can almost see that it's a very different picture, that the lower density areas were more affected than the high density areas in that particular case. It's not the case in all cities, but we think that density and well-planned dense areas actually enabled a better response to the measures applied for COVID as well. So we advocate to plan for well-designed urban density with the supporting infrastructure, and to consider multi-centric urban patterns that distribute facilities and functions across the city. COVID acted as a stress test on urban systems, if you like, and it showed out clear weak spots that under normal circumstances would have been tolerable maybe, but under severe testing conditions like with the pandemic, these areas came out as highly vulnerable areas. So slum areas, informal settlement areas, not only in terms of the risk of infection, but the inability to respond adequately to deal with the virus and the outbreak of the pandemic. But these weak spot areas are not only just physical areas within the city, they're also systemic within the city. So areas like suburban areas with a lack of infrastructure and supporting mixed use and public transport and non-motorized transport options, the only option is actually for private car use to access services and facilities within the city. And that contributes again to air pollution. And that creates another weakness, a systemic weakness within the city in terms of dealing with a pandemic like this. And the recommendation really is that cities should recognize these weak spots and weak areas within the city and try to address the underlying conditions that create those circumstances and plan for growth while reducing the initial inequity and fragmented city structures. Mobility was probably one of the key areas that were hit because of the pandemic. Firstly, it was reduced dramatically during lockdown areas, but also cities cannot function without movement within them. They need that for economic regeneration, for distribution of food and other necessities and so forth. And most of the changes were in terms of the different mobility options that opened up within cities. And the cities that had more mobility options, like NMT and so forth, could function better than cities that only had one option, let's say the private car. And those changes has taken place, and we need to try and encourage cities to build on the momentum that's been created for alternative means of mobility or not being mobile at all if it's not necessary. Public transport is one of those areas that the demand for that have plummeted due to the fear of contagion, even though the evidence suggests that it wasn't one of the key areas for the spread of the disease. And I think also in terms of just the financial viability of these systems, a lot of work will still have to be done to reorganize and reorientate public transportation systems to be viable in the future and to ensure that it remains an affordable and safe mode of transportation that is also critical to create sustainability within the city. The main trend that came through, I think the most drastic trend in terms of mobility was around non-motorized transportation, where we've seen a proliferation of non-motorized transportation that was triggered by both public and individual responses. And there's a growing number of cities that are expanding their NMT networks. The mayor of Paris announced a 15-minute neighborhood kind of system. And the takeaway from this is really that we can promote well-distributed and safe NMT infrastructure that will greatly enhance the city's resilience in not only in terms of pandemics, but also in terms of sustainability and air quality. The last point under the cities that I want to deal with is the digital side of it. There's the notion that digital infrastructure may be the sanitation of the future. And I think there was a very clear shift to digital lifestyles in terms of working from home. And we saw the importance of that kind of infrastructure within cities that allowed people to work in different modalities. The consequences of that has also been that we've seen an exodus from mono-use areas like office parks, business parks, and downtown of cities. Only the future will tell to what extent that will be reused after the pandemic. But we see a clear trend that the operations of business will change to the extent where there's the possibility to change the use of those monofunctional areas into more mixed use areas, and possibly create the opportunity for cities to totally reorganize those areas for new purposes. The risk, of course, is that we increase the digital divide, and that marginalized communities stay behind and cannot exercise the advantages of a digital working environment, and that also needs to be addressed. I'm going to now hand over to Antara to take us through the neighborhood and the building scale.
Thank you, Herman. I hope everybody can hear me clearly.
Antara,
Yes.
I just have a small request. If we have a 3 minute before we go for next speech, I believe you will not be speaking longer. My request.
Okay, yes. Okay, so going into the neighborhood scale now, public space, as we saw, was actually offering residents a respite from lockdowns. We saw a lot of people moving out, so it was essential for community and social resilience. And also it became pop-up spaces to build a lot of emergency infrastructure like hospitals or quarantine facilities. So public space continues to play a key role. So one of the recommendations was design flexible public spaces that can support these emergency services, as well as contribute to the social, economic, and cultural voice of the people. And then the second thing is that the public space should be equitably distributed and accessible by all communities. So that would include elderly, children, women, and people with special needs. So that is very important to not have an imbalance in public space. Next slide, please. And then we go and explore this idea of a 15-minute neighborhood, which takes into account two of our principles of being compact and mixed use. By a compact footprint, it would mean a lot of the uses in a daily life of a person are met within a 15-minute walk. And then by mixed use, it would actually allow a lot of buildings in the neighborhood to cater to retail, or like shops and restaurants, schools, clinics would all be within the same neighborhood. This sort of trend moves away from a single-use commercial downtown or a single-use residential neighborhood. So this idea of compact mixed-use neighborhoods will become even more relevant as we go further. So our recommendations are to retrofit existing neighborhoods to become mixed-use and allow for a compact, dense living while accommodating for all their needs and infrastructure. And then also design flexible spaces that could become mixed use in the future, if not currently, in cases of emergencies and pandemics like these. Next slide, please. So yeah, we finally go down to the micro scale, which is the building scale, which also saw some drastic changes that we need, perhaps because a lot of people are now spending time indoors, and the house becomes your office, it becomes the children's classroom. So poor housing quality and lack of access to basic infrastructure firstly contributes to being unhealthy in a way. If you're not having good water and sanitation, then you're already vulnerable to a lot of diseases. And then we also observe a lot of overcrowding and poor light and ventilation qualities in a lot of informal settlements or slums in developing countries. So those also need to be tackled to ensure a healthier community. So by preventing overcrowding and ensuring that people have access to adequate, affordable housing, along with good access to basic services, is first and foremost. And then we would also recommend that most houses should at least have access to some form of outdoor space to allow people to escape, not into a crowded space, but just to get some time close to nature for their mental well-being. Next. And then finally, even buildings, as we saw with the closure of offices or areas which are completely deserted, were adapted to become, say, short-term hotels or stays for homeless people, and hospital and other food distribution services. So the building design itself should be flexible to allow these multiple functions and changing in work lifestyles or home standards. We also know in a lot of countries, parking structures are looked at, where you could possibly adopt them in the future, where we can imagine a future with fewer cars, and then we will modify them to become other mixed-use spaces. Next. So then finally, some concluding thoughts which bring all of this together and tie it into a larger perspective. We know that the communities and settlements have a key role to play in the health and wellness of communities. They provide access to healthy food, access to health care, access to clean water, air, sanitation, good housing. All of that is important for a community's well-being and resilience to bounce back better. And then this needs support and response from all levels of governments that are in place. And COVID-19 also brought attention to some of the spatial inequalities which have been in place, but now are just exposed a little more. And I fear this might become even more evident as we roll out vaccines or things like that. So we need to ensure that certain sections of society are not neglected, and there are equitable spaces designed, cities that are inclusive and sustainable in the future. So we also know that the response to these emergencies and pandemics should take into account the political, cultural, and socioeconomic context of cities. A lot of the measures which were adopted in some cases did not work for the best. Some lockdowns were too harsh probably for some certain communities and things like that. So there needs to be a little bit of context to be taken into account. And then all the policies that we recommend, we do understand that they have to be multi-sectoral and multi-scalar. So they're all interconnected, and they have to take into account governance systems, financing systems, urban health, and yeah, planning and design. So yeah, that brings us to the end of our presentation, and thank you very much. We're open to questions. I hope I didn't go beyond time too much.
No, that was perfectly fine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Herman and Antara, for the presentation. You summarized it well with the concluding thoughts. I think we can come back on some of the key building blocks for moving forward towards better cities in terms of function and form in the debate. In the interest of time, I will introduce the next speakers who will give a keynote. So we have the ambassador, Melba Pria, ambassador of Mexico to Japan. And she will reflect on some key elements as part of healthy and inclusive cities as a way forward. Then we will have Stefano Boeri, all well known to you from Milano office, who's reflecting on scenario planning in this year of pandemic. And then we will have Deputy Mayor Anuela Ristani of Tirana, where a lot of very interesting transformations happened already in the city, to hear about reflections also how from there to move forward. So Rajendra, if you want to add something for the next speaker.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elisa. On behalf of Ambassador Her Excellency Ms. Melba Pria, I would just like to convey the message that because of the time difference in Japan, she is unable to make it to come physically, but she has definitely conveyed the message to ISOCARP and all the delegates for the successful event. When talking about Her Excellency Melba Pria, she is one of the very strongest voice for talking about cities and transformation. She is, though she is a diplomat, but she is very vocal about talking about cities and the transformation. She has done extensively work in her home country in Mexico. She was ex-ambassador in India. She was ambassador of Mexico in India before moving to ambassador of Mexico. So she could not be able to be here. We have a couple of embassy officials from Japan. They are watching us live. I request my colleague to play the video message by Her Excellency Ms. Melba Pria, please. Federico.
Good day to you all. My name is Melba Pria, and I am the Mexican ambassador to Japan. I thank very much Noida International University, ISOCARP, and the Urban Economy Forum and the UN Habitat for inviting me to be with you today. Healthy and inclusive urban spaces. Why would we want even to think about these? These are key topics when reflecting current state of many Mexican cities and their future. And why not say it? You and I live in cities, and therefore we need to think about this reality. In the next decade, the vast majority of demographic growth in Mexico will occur in urban areas. The number of cities will grow significantly, and the type of cities that we will have will be very, very important, because we will grow from 380 cities to more than 960 cities by 2030. In other words, the number will triple in the following 10 years. More than 80% of our population, the Mexicans, we will be living in these urban areas, and it is expected the majority of this population will have low income. The panorama signifies great challenges for Mexico in terms of long time and higher costs of commutes, need of connectivity, environmental impact, and socio-economic inequity and inequality. Mexico is not very far away from what will happen to Indian cities. The productive, political, scientific, and cultural forces are concentrated in these cities and will be concentrated even more. And therefore, it is necessary to reflect about how we make them healthy and inclusive. I am using this PowerPoint for you to have an idea of what I am talking about. Mexico has decided to put together the National Plan for Territorial Ordering and Urban Development 2019-2024, recognizing the uncontrolled horizontal growth of the urban zone of Mexico City, which has caused low sustainability, deterioration of public and recreation spaces, poor infrastructure, and poor urban public services. Additionally, accelerated urban demographic growth and its demand of natural and energy sources have caused critic air pollution and loss and deterioration of natural habitats, and of course natural resources such as water. Allow me to remind you that Mexico City is a city that is high up in the mountains, 2,000 meters above sea level, and in the basin of a valley. So imagine just the costs that it takes to bring water to a growing population. All these pressures had impact in the quality of life of its population, the use of their rights, and also of our identity and sense of community. This national plan seeks to put the inhabitants in the center of its public policies of urban development, taking into consideration aspects like cultural diversity, natural environment, regional and local economies, and its potentials and needs. When we talk about cultural diversity, in the case of Mexico as of India, we talk about different communities, different sense of being, and different languages. And of course, in a city as vast as Mexico City, natural environments are very, very many. Therefore, the participation of the population in the decision-making process is a must. The plan has served as a framework for different initiatives, especially those that reconstruct and revitalize urban regions that have been lagging behind from national development and are crossing the line between poverty and extreme poverty. Many specialists in urban development say that poverty and extreme poverty are even more extreme when you are in a city. One very interesting and exemplary initiative is the Program of Urban Improvement, Programa de Mejoramiento Urbano, Mi México Late, which literally means My Mexico Beats, and it is presented as a beating heart. The program is executed by the Secretaría of Agricultura, Territorial and Urban Development, which is one of our ministries, and is one of the 25 priority programs of the current government. This program seeks to dignify public spaces and give opportunities of development to those urban communities with more than 50,000 inhabitants. It seeks to improve the urban environment through rehabilitation and improvement of basic infrastructure, urban equipment, public spaces, mobility, and connectivity. It is considered, and it considers within its programs, home improvement or substitution of living spaces for the most vulnerable population. And it also seeks to regularize and give legal certainty for housing lots, urban equipment, and public spaces. That is why the participation of the community is key. And when we talk about community in an urban space, it is a different and more difficult idea of how to build community. More than 80 community committees have been installed in order to follow up and supervise the projects and guarantee the execution of all of these ideas. Among the most significant projects executed already are, of course, the construction of community development centers, cultural and recreational centers, libraries, sports centers, baseball fields, new schools, medical centers, markets, space rehabilitation, streets and public spaces, improvement and projects of mobility and connectivity, because all of those cities will be within other cities. The citizens who are interested in following up these projects are able to do so online, so even that had to be constructed. One visible trend in Mexico is the reconversion of urban spaces through space recycling. Today, many local governments are rescuing spaces by utilizing underbridges, constructing parks in corners, and habilitating more pedestrian streets, creating these public spaces where residents can feel their own, give back their roles as centers of the cities. Another trends are the urban orchards. These orchards offer accessible and economic alternatives to improve daily nutrition, promote consumption of local products, and create, again, a sense of community among residents. This trend is most visible in big cities such as Mexico City and has been promoted especially and particularly by the civil society. Finally, let me address one very important topic about cities, which is inclusivity. In 2016, the General Law of Urban Settlement was modified, establishing that all buildings need to comply with all the guidelines for inclusive city. That makes clear that any urban recovery includes accessibility for all. More than 6% of the Mexican population, which means 7.5 million people, have a certain type of disability. You wouldn't like to climb 10 stairs if you had no legs. The 10th anniversary of the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disability in 2018 made it more evident the importance of creating inclusive cities. In Mexico, communities and local governments were inspired to take action. One example was the construction of inclusive recreational public parks. These parks are not exclusively for children with disability. These are for all children, no matter their condition, but giving the opportunity to play and live with equality in the same community. These parks have had and have been able to eliminate physical and social barriers among the population. Mexico City has currently 6 inclusive recreational parks, and these are in the center of the national system for integral family development. Finally, Mexico and its cities are part of the rising global urbanization due to the vast majority of demographic growth, and that demographic growth will occur in cities. The forecasts are a little daunting, actually. The numbers of Mexico's cities will triple, as I said before, and we expect that Mexico City will be one of the 10 biggest cities in the world. Today, it is already said that we are one of the biggest cities in the world. So this context, this reality makes us reflect about what do we want to have as cities? What type of cities do we want? And to face the enormous challenge that will identify the cities of the future. When we talk about future, we don't say 2050, we say 2030 or 2040. So the plan is an urgent plan to construct and consider key elements that will make our living spaces inclusive, healthy, and great urban spaces. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talking to you in this very important forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Her Excellency Melba Pria. I would also like to acknowledge the embassy officials from Japan, Ms. Ami Kameta Miyamoto. Thank you so much for your support. Now we have Stefano Boeri. He just joined us a few minutes back. Federico, can you check with the Stefano Boeri if it's there?
Hello to everybody.
Oh. Hi, sir. Very, very good afternoon. I mean, it's such a great to see you again, sir.
It's a pleasure for me too. It's a pleasure for me.
Yeah. So thank you for joining. I would like to just introduce a bit about the session which we have been doing. We have with us the Deputy Mayor of Tirana. I mean, one of the very strongest name in the city of Tirana. We have the mayor representative from the city of Malawi, Africa. We have Herman from UN Habitat. We have Antara Tandon from UN. We have Jaya Dinshaw from World Research Institute, India. So thank you so much, Stefano, for joining us. It's always a great to see you. To introduce Stefano, I would just like say a very brief word. Stefano is one of the very, very known architect based in Milan. His project, which the Bosco Verticale, has shown the whole world a new way of looking at the building, how the building are responsive, the issues which we have been talking. I would request if Stefano can share his presentation, and after that we will also have request Stefano to be with us for some very brief short question answer. Over to Stefano Boeri.
Okay. Thanks. So I believe that what we can do to transform cities from being primary causes of global warming and in the wake of recent flooding, in some cases also the victims of climate change generated by the increase of CO2. This is what we have to seriously consider. And I think we can, what we can do, it's also to try to ensure that cities become the leading characters in a vast planetary campaign to reduce global warming. So from the cause to the victim to the protagonist of a campaign to reduce, to tackle and slow down global warming. So I think that first of all we have to be aware that this pandemic crisis is not an isolated event, but one that is closely linked to the climate change crisis. And therefore, the fragility that the situation has transmitted to us due to the pandemic is something that we have to know how to accept and deal with. So this fragility tells us that the size of this phenomena that we don't know or which we are not aware of not knowing has expanded enormously. But it also tells us that we have to stop our aggressive controlling relationship with nature. Nature is no longer just what we think the outside should be, outside the city, outside our homes, I mean, outside our bodies. Nature has proven to be fundamentally integral with the life of our species, and one small virus has managed to establish a frightening fast system of osmosis between all the individuals of that species on our planet. So as a result, we somehow have to rethink our idea of cities and metropolises in a completely different scenario, while at the same time coming to terms with climate change. So I'm now to simply to present 9 ideas for the future of cities. It doesn't go. Sorry, we have a problem. Okay. So the first idea is about the idea of planetary green corridors. I think that the Richard Weller's world park concept must be extended to the whole planet. We have to create green corridors everywhere that are able to implement and conserve species biodiversity. Protected area and forest must be linked to greener cities, and this system that we have seen created by the Green Great Wall in Africa, designed to defend against the expansion of the Sahara Desert, and which we see also on the way in China and the Gobi Desert, must be put in effect all over the world. Vast planetary corridors of biodiversity. Then we have to talk about megacities and basically about the metropolitan environment, about the system of metropolis. So I believe that they have to be transnational and become a type of archipelago. I believe that the project that we are going to realize for the Grand Genève, for Genève in Swiss, is both important and relevant from this point of view. However, this is not simply an extension of Genève, but rather, together with Annecy, the creation of an archipelago system around the mountain. So the center of this metropolis is not a square, not a monument, neither simple a temple or a synagogue or a church nor mosque. Instead, it's a mountain of biodiversity. The figure mirrors the perimeter of CERN particle accelerator and provide energy. Yet the concept of an international archipelago metropolis is fundamental. A metropolis where green represents the sea and where city and small town are logically connected, giving every individual citizen the possibility of accessing services and a lifestyle in an area with a maximum of 15-20 minutes of travel time. But this naturally brings us to the concept of forestry, or better to urban forestry. Forestry is the way in which planetary corridors enter the metropolitan archipelagos. Nature helps us, first of all. It cleans the air of particular that in some areas there was the greatest cause of the spreading of COVID-19 infection. It also transforms already produced CO2 into oxygen, reduces heat, increases biodiversity, and reduces energy consumption. So forestry is therefore a fundamental issue as the idea of mobility. Why? Because in a certain way, I think that we have to learn to no longer move about with individually owned cars, but by sharing a number of private cars instead of those that extensively occupy the surface and the surfaces of our roads at present. So we have to really revolutionize the concept of mobility. And from this point of view, I have to say we also need to imagine a different relationship, both between cities themselves and between city and that system of historical rural settlement that covers the whole, for instance, Europe, the whole continent of Europe, and those internal European areas which we must relearn to occupy and inhabit. I believe that today now we are showing a project we are doing in Mexico, which is a forest city for 130,000 people and with more than 7 million of plants. But I believe that in a certain way, thanks to our new found digital literacy and the fact that in some way we have learned to work, and we have learned to not simply that how work can be an activity that follows our bodies, but together with the modification to a number of patterns regarding the working week, we understood that we can think in terms of breaking up that tripartite division, work, residence, leisure, on which a Western city has been built. We can also imagine that transferring urban life to external centers, avoiding sprawl, avoiding the tragedy of the expanded city that has ruined areas of Europe, of the world, re-inhabiting small nuclei that had been towns and cities in the past, and which guarantee us powerful relationship with nature will be an amazing scenario. So you see here a project that we have developed together with Slow Food in China, where we are proposing to re-habit some of the, let's say, small rural villages in the Chinese countryside, adding some utilities like a library, a museum, and a bookstore. So, and a school, sorry. So I really believe that if digitally connected, we can imagine transferring urban life to external centers, avoiding sprawl. And I think that we can turn into place for urban communication. And these rural and historical villages, well, if digitally connected, could well be interesting elements of example of an alternative way of life in contact with cities and their support, and which these communities can provide with clean air, drinking water, the best food, and from which they would receive support network for commercial distribution, large university and multinational corporate headquarters. Obviously, from this point of view, agriculture and energy have to become two fundamental elements of an idea of self-sufficiency. So the metropolis of the future must be metropolis which in some way can become truly self-sufficient thanks to the fact that each building is now able to capture renewable energy, store and distribute it around itself. This is a new district that we are designing for north of the Tirana, the capital of Albania, and it's an amazing project that was imagined from the Albanian government after the earthquake that destroyed part of the Albanian territory 1 year ago. But this project has ambition to become the first serious post-pandemic district with also different value in terms of energy self-sufficiency and distribution of green environment. So I believe that in the same way, an interesting and intelligent system of agricultural areas and zone for transforming agricultural products into food would be not only a great lifeline for the labor market, but also a fundamental element in guaranteeing a concept of considerable self-sufficiency. All this revolves around the idea of community. Communities, well, but it's a very generic word, but what the communities we need are communities of vibrant life and exchange. We cannot imagine urban ways of life that have no form of exchange between different elements and cultures at their centers. As Jan Jacobs said, cities are made up of density and variety. And I believe that intensity is a key concept. We need large metropolises to made up of neighborhoods and districts where there is this intensity of exchanging. Just as we need traditional rural villages to return to being small cities where there is also this intensity of exchanges. This is a fundamental relationship and revolves around the concept of community. Well, the last two issues look at the need to be able to reclaim public spaces. One thing is linked to the progressive reduction of parking areas that today occupy a substantial part of public spaces, often completely useless, but is also linked to reclaiming of external areas that are considerably safer from the point of view of infection by the virus transmitted by air. These have to become places for living where all those aspects of life that today take place inside buildings dedicated to culture, commercial, leisure, work, and sport have to move outside. In general, together with this transfer to the outside, there is another fundamental process which concerns the possibility of making interior spaces fluid, breaking down functional distinction and imagining spaces with, let's say, variable geometry. Well, we have to give roofs, as you see here is exactly one of the concepts that we are developing in this new district in Tirana, a function once more, and consider that roofs today could be what courtyards were until a few decades ago. So in other words, places where the inhabitant of a building or a block worker grew and met other citizens, a completely safe and protected warm place for social interaction. So just to sum up what I tried to synthesize in these 10 minutes, planetary corridors of biodiversity, 1. Archipelago metropolis, 2, able to incorporate system of living nature, thanks to the third issue, which is urban forestry. Soft mobility, 4. And above all, sustainable no longer based on the concept of ownership, and which gradually and rapidly does away the burning old fossil fuel. So 5, a reciprocity between metropolises and networks of rural and historical villages. 6, the idea of a community as a place where the distance between bodies never affects the intensity of relationship. And then 7, a great fluidity of interior space, the relevance of the cultural sport, and then what we are doing about the change and the fluidity in interior space. So this is some points that for me are extremely relevant for the future of our city. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Stefano, sir. It has been always a treat listening you. I mean, such a wonderful information. I will request my co-chair, Elisabeth Belpaire, to summarize before we go for question answer. Stefano, sir, I would request if you can stay just 5 minutes more. We will take few questions. Elisabeth, would you like to summarize?
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation and the reflections on different elements for where we're heading to and how we can use the opportunity of a pandemic. I'd just like to take some of the elements of the previous two speakers, which is from Herman and Antara, for taking us to the different scales at which planners in practice also work. The regional scale, which often has been left behind, but the crucial element of food systems and what the impact of the disruption of the systems can bring. We heard about this, the importance of strengthening these regional urban links. At the city scale, the insights on how spatial inequalities lead to inequitable access, and while higher spatial quality equities give more equitable access also to vulnerable people, and that this seems more resilient and that those areas do better. The element of density and some insights on this.
Elisabeth, I'm just sorry to interrupt in between. I receive a message from the office of Stefano because he just has to rush. Stefano, if you can just take one question. Elisa, after Stefano left, we will take it extension because I will take just one question for Stefano. I believe that if he's here, we request since you mentioned about Tirana Riverside project, we have a deputy mayor of Tirana with us, Anuela Ristani. If we can have only one question, I'm sorry to all the delegates, we will not be able to take question for Boeri at this time. Maybe we'll have with Stefano for some other session, but over to you, Ms. Anuela, just one question. And Stefano, if you can answer that question, and after that you can leave, please, sir.
With pleasure.
Did you want me to ask the question or answer it? I didn't understand. I'm sorry.
I request if you would like to ask any question to Stefano, since he
No,
mentioned.
we work with Stefano, so I'm pretty clear on what the project is.
We are working together, and it's an amazing experience. So thanks so much, Anuela.
It's a long time now, so we really know each other very well.
Anyway, one question.
I think that what we are doing together, it will be extremely important to show us possible to imagine a new paradigm of community life and public spaces and so on.
I have a question for Stefano, because the elements, I think we indeed need to think about the opportunity, how we can revolutionize, how we can really leapfrog forward and don't go back to what we talked about for the past decades. But the reality is, for instance, to revolutionize your urban forests, etc. The reality is that a lot of standards, laws and policies, it takes time to make them. It takes also time to change them. So these can be barriers in, using the opportunity to really make change in the short term, but for long-term benefit. How do you reflect on this?
Well, sure. I believe that you're right. It's we have a lot of obstacles. First of all, bureaucracy, and then basically, I believe that there is a cultural resistance to accept, to consider this phase, this very peculiar moment of our life, as a moment that we have to accelerate, processes and trends and projects that are not, let's say, completely new, because what we see is that basically we have the opportunity to accelerate something that was already ongoing around us. So if we just think to this idea of reimagine cities and metropolitan environment with, let's say, a new paradigm, the one of an archipelago of district with quite a relevant self-sufficiency in terms of to the citizens. So this idea of 15-minute city, for instance, is not something that was, let's say, only with the pandemic, was already there before. But we know that now we can, also using the legacy of this pandemic in terms of digital alphabetization, for instance, or awareness of the possibility of develop the remote working as a daily opportunity. So thanks to this, let's say new condition, we can now accelerate this kind of process. We have to do our best to reimagine our cities, probably being aware that the older paradigm of the city founded on a, let's say, system of few epicenter capable to attract and collect crowds of people and flows of people, so is over. And we have to reimagine how we can redistribute the centralities in our city. So it is not about a revolution, it's about a serious acceleration of processes that are already ongoing before the pandemic. And that's the same, it's happening with forestry and urban forestry. In Tirana, we started 5 years ago, to imagine an orbital forest all around the city and to plant thousands and thousands of trees inside cities. But for sure now, I think that what the mayor and the deputy mayor of Tirana are doing is to straighten this process, to make it stronger, faster, and so on. But Anuela knows this well.
Thank you so much, sir. I mean, it was a great to be with you, and thank you so much for your time. There is one comment I will not request you to answer, but just a suggestion, a comment by a mayor from Malawi in Africa, that how can we improve cities as a recycling and localization of agriculture? Question to Stefano. Ms. Guterres, I'm very sorry, we will not be able to take the question because Stefano has to rush. You can write to him personally.
Yes, please, with great pleasure.
Thank you so much, sir. I mean, it was indeed great pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much, sir.
Goodbye.
Okay. Over to Elisabeth.
Okay, thank you, Rajendra. I will introduce the next keynote from Deputy Mayor Anuela Ristani from Tirana. Yes, you can take the floor, I think, in the interest of time. It's 5:10. Yes.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here, and it's really really humbling to go after Stefano, since we've been working together in Tirana since 2015. So, you know, to have him be able to map the Tirana experience in a more global context, and more than that, to be able to fit in within the COVID challenges, it's really humbling. It's a really humbling experience. But I just wanted to share my screen for you a little bit, so I can give you a little bit of an overview of why we're here and why is Tirana interesting in this time, and what has happened in terms of urban development, so that, you know, we could understand on, you know, how to cope with not just COVID, but basically crisis in general. So let me see if this works. Okay. I think this is fine, right? Yes. You can kind of like see where I'm heading at. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of an overview of where we are. So this is where we are. They think we're more Easterners, but we're actually right in the middle, hence the connection with Italian architecture, because we're basically neighbors. But, you know, we're caught somewhere in the middle of 500 years of Ottoman Empire, and then 50 years of really harsh communist regime, and then 30 years of aspiring to get into the EU, but not being able to. So this is, you know, kind of like our context of where we're coming from. And just to give you guys a little bit of an overview of where we came as a city, this is a global satellite image of 89. This is a global satellite image of 10 years later. So this is 99. This is 2009, and this is 2019. So it's just to show you a little bit of a scale of how much the city has developed and how much it has sprawled. And we basically had to manage a city that quadrupled in only 25 years. We're running a census now, and it has probably more than quadrupled. So this number should kind of be like roughly 1 million. But where do you start to manage such a city, despite all challenges and despite everything else? We did start from the center. We did start from the center because that is they say the agora of Mediterranean cities in general. This is where everybody gathers. So we started from this project of the city center, where before it was transformed to what you're looking now. This is actually pre-COVID. It was basically a roundabout for cars. We had 150,000 cars running through the space that this little guy is biking to. And we just decided that a city center for cars was not a city center. So the first development that we had in the city was basically transforming it into a place that works for people. Now, you might, I love to always show images of before, you know, everybody's wearing masks and keeping a distance, because this is, you know, something we aspire to go to back. But it didn't just serve people in normal times, because it offered such a large surface, and because it basically provided for an urban park right in the middle of the city. It also provided for a safe space for people to social distance, but to also socialize, you know, at a distance, because there are two different concepts. And to keep basically sane, because this is exactly in the middle of the city. This is where all the institutions are based, and this is where all the economic life goes on. And just like that, we transformed other spaces of the city with the same mindset of, you know, being able to be outdoors and being able to be in a safe space. And the amphitheater, which was, you know, an epitome of, you know, entertainment space outdoors, was transformed into a more usable space as well. And it was basically the only space where during COVID we could hold any sort of event, because, you know, it was safer. We could still hold a distance, but still have an audience. It was basically the only functioning stage for any kind of entertainment for the entire city of 1 million during the summer that we just passed and before rain start. So, you know, it's just an oasis of sanity in the middle of this crisis. This was what it looked like, and I'd love to show it what it looked like before. But even without, you know, that density, it was still something usable. The other side of transformation I wanted to show you guys is the bazaar. In the Mediterranean culture, we love to do our shopping of fresh produce and groceries outdoors. And this is one of those spaces where it was transformed from something that didn't get much use to something where people could both entertain and also keep doing their shopping, because it's such a characteristic thing for us to really get our fresh tomatoes and juice and everything else within, you know, this marketplace where you could also socialize. And despite that, the last project I wanted to show you was the transformation of this boulevard, which is the extension of the backbone of the city. And it was the first project that was designed in a democratic way. What do we mean by designing democratically? Well, in a city that has only 17% of its people owning cars, we decided that we shouldn't use 17%, we should use proportionately 70% of the space for cars and the rest of it for people who don't own cars. So in the same way, we constructed this new infrastructure by thinking of what's going to be the future, who do you really serve? And in the last 50 years or so, not just in Tirana, but everywhere, we've built cities for the active person, for the person who goes from A to B, who owns a car, who doesn't need much time to run around and socialize because they have to do work and they have to keep running. But we never thought of, what happens to the seniors? What happens to the ones that don't own a car? What happens to young people, to teenagers, to kids? And if you do manage this extreme segments of, the debilitated ones or like the non-extremely active ones, then you come to think of cities that were not built for them and did not work for them. Why is this important in the COVID thinking and in the COVID times? Well, first of all, this was a boulevard, and I want to show you a story. This is an aerial picture of the same space. First of all, because without providing a distance and spaces for pedestrians, we're not providing any safe way of transportation. In Tirana, during the lockdown, you couldn't really use your private car because, nobody could use vehicles of any sort unless, you had a special permit and for essential workers and for essential services. So what it meant was that the only available options for you, not to necessarily commute to work, but to communicate with the city or to get stuff done, was either through bikes or through walking. If we didn't have that infrastructure in place, that would have been really hard. What I mean by this is this didn't necessarily happen because of the pandemic. But what it means is that if you build cities for people, no matter at what time, no matter what is your crisis, no matter what is your planning, that it turns out that the same principles work in extreme times, such as the ones we're going to as well. We build the city for people who don't own cars, so don't have the same means. You build the city for people who are economically vulnerable, so they need they have less resources to get from A to B, and they have less resources to spend their free time in more sophisticated, let's say, compounds. They just want to make use of the public space of the city. It turns out that everybody didn't, almost everyone was absolved from alternative ways of spending their time other than what was available in the city. And if you didn't have this infrastructure in place, then the space for them was very limited. This is how much use this public spaces get. This is simply a pedestrian area. There is no entertainment going on. There's no alternative attractions. There's nothing to really gather, or there's not an artificial magnet in this. This is just a public space being used by the citizens. Could you imagine if this was just cars in there? There would not be nearly as many people. They would just be stuck in there and then going from A to B with just one person, probably in one car. The last thing, bunch of projects I wanted to show you, and this is something that, as it turns out, was a very decisive factor for us, or for my team being reelected on our second term, was playgrounds. In a city of 1 million, where we take pride of the really young age, of the mean age in Tirana is 34 to 35, presumably we would have a lot of thinking for our kids and for, you know, the youngsters. It turned out that, well, 5 years ago, there were 0 playgrounds for kids. There were 0 public playgrounds. So we got together and said, you know, this cannot be. And our commitment was that for every month that we would be in the office, we would have at least 1 new playground for the city. And it started from this one that, you know, became really big and famous. And then it became a challenge for us to transform any public space, such as this one, in a public park. Why was this? So this just shows you some pictures of what this was before and what it was after, but there are endless pictures showing an idle space that was otherwise not used, or, you know, not used for good purposes, and transform it for the whole community. Why is this important for us? It's not just serving kids, but because having this oasis of getting together in communities, it serves a lot of functions. First of all, it serves the community building function. When you're sending your kids downstairs to play, first of all, you feel safe. They're playing in the neighborhood. Second of all, you have seniors, you have grandmas and grandpas looking over at them and socializing with other grandmas and grandpas, and you have parents who are with their kids who are socializing with other parents. So there you have a sense of community, but also you have a sense of security. If you have people on the street, if you have eyes on the street, like Jane Jacobs would say, then, you know, there's very little chance for you to have any mal-thinking or malfunctions of the community's assets. Why this was important during COVID? Absolutely it was, because if it wasn't for these spaces, there would be no alternative for people who couldn't go to other areas or didn't have any other space to basically take some fresh air and to socialize in a safe way. And having this playgrounds, and the 48 were for the first mandate, but up to now we have 60 of them. Having 60 of these spaces that are massive spaces in between neighborhoods work for people who are otherwise in lockdown and isolated, did wonders for them, for their sanity, for their interaction, for the mere fact that, you know, you can go downstairs, you're not locked to these tiny apartments with very little resources, but you could actually go and have some peace of mind and have some peace of eyes. During lockdown, we actually had events, concerts taking place in these spaces, absolutely of no other attendance but through the windows. But it did give some good vibes, and it did give a sense of normalcy and a sense of resilience. This is just to show you how they're spread out throughout the city, so that, you know, again, it's not just certain neighborhoods or it's not just certain areas, but it's everybody. And then again, it made it possible so that kids who could practice sports, or that adults or whoever would keep doing some activity, although in very limited and in very regulated way, in these public spaces of the entire city free of charge. The last thing I want to show you, and it's a cute picture of our kids running in bikes, is absolutely something that we take very much pride on, is our bike lanes. Why did the bike lanes become important during the pandemic? I mean, and this question is answered a lot better and bigger cities than Tirana, but it obviously shows why this was important to prepare hands-on before. Our plan for like the minimum grid for the bike lanes is of 47 kilometers. We are up to 40 as we speak, but during the pandemic, this was a great chance to revamp our efforts. And just like a lot of cities did, is basically taking back the space. So, you know, you just do pop-up lanes overnight, and then the next day they're all occupied, so that the cars who are parking there are not parking there anymore. The last thing, other than the bike lanes, is also pedestrian spaces. If we do not prioritize pedestrians and make it easy for them, obviously obviously it's not gonna be safe enough, and we're not gonna be luring people into, you know, parking their cars. We're only gonna encourage them to pollute more and to drive more. So, you know, some of this play with the streets and with pedestrian areas, doubling the size of the sidewalks is just some of the changes that we're able to make during the lockdown, because obviously we could have a lot more time and space to work, but these are changes that are not just for COVID, are not just for the pandemic. These are changes that work for entirely for the city, and they are there to stay. I got a question from one of this online conferences we're doing. Are you guys going back to enlarging the street for the cars? I said absolutely not. If we would, our citizens would be really mad, because the bigger the sidewalk, the bigger the business on the sidewalk, the bigger the interaction. People are encouraged to walk more, they stroll more, they take their bikes, they walk, they socialize more. How many people do you meet when you're driving? Nobody. How many people do you meet on the street when you're going to work? Lots of people. And it helps with the well-being of the entire city, and it helps with the well-being of the community and with the safety of the community. We are expert. These are just some examples of the pop-up bike lanes. Why they're called pop-up is because you basically first occupy the space that was otherwise used for idle parking. And then, once you've occupied it and they know that this is not the space where you would park, then you interfere with basic infrastructure such as the poles that are being installed in the next picture, or then, you pave the path with a certain color or a certain signage that is required. But first you occupy it. So, this is entirely for bikes now, no more parking for cars. And this is just an example of, how we do them with the community. The last initiative I wanted to show you guys, and this is nothing to do with the urban development or infrastructure, is Adopt a Grandma. And this is because of a lot of young people turned out they had nothing to do during the lockdown, everything was closed. So we threw in a challenge and we said, if you have nothing to do, here's an idea. Identify a senior citizen in your apartment block so you don't have to go out. And when you're cooking and helping your parents cook, make sure that you have an extra meal for them. So, you have an extra ration for them, and then deliver it to their doorstep. And this became such a big challenge that, you had this fantastic videos posted on Instagram, went viral, of, really young people, like teenagers who never hold a knife or, had made an egg in their life, who are really so interested as to take the best picture and take the best time lapse of the dish they're cooking, and then delivering to their grandparents. But it made it all so much more bearable, and it just made the city a lot more bearable. But I really wanted to share that with you. And the last but not least, Stefano mentioned this, the new neighborhoods of Tirana. They didn't come as a consequence of the pandemic. They came as a consequence of another catastrophic event, which was the devastating earthquake we had a year ago, that basically destroyed massive amounts of buildings in the city, not just in Tirana, but in surrounding areas as well. So the massive effort of the government to relocate these people and to basically give them housing turned out to be more than just a social experiment, turned out to be more of an urban experiment. So this is one of the projects that we have, this one with Stefano, and he introduced it to you. Why is it a COVID-free space? Because it's a mixed use space as well. Somebody mentioned the 15-minute city. This is exactly how 15-minute city works in a planned way. So here in Tirana, we have a lot of services and the city is very condensed. So a lot of services you can access without need for transportation. But this neighborhood in particular is such that it gives safe space for people who work within the same neighborhood, but also people who live in the same neighborhood, with the idea of the mixed use concept. So that if we needed to house people who are, obviously financially vulnerable, and they are more economically disfavored, this could have been, kind of like a ghetto-like community where you house people that have limited means, but it didn't. This is just a beautiful neighborhood where you have public institutions, you have private services, you have all sorts of businesses, taking place there, but you also have some housing, You also have market value residential buildings, and everybody lives within the same space. So during the day when everybody's at work, people who work in these institutions and in this area can use the spaces in between in a safe and socially distanced way, but also have the luxury of a residential type of environment. And then during the evening or during the free hours or during the weekend, the residents gets more space, because half of the population basically who is just working there and not living there has already left. So this is what we're looking forwards to, and Stefano was introducing that before. Didn't come as a result of this, but thank you so much for your attention. This was just a snap of what we're doing here, and I welcome any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Anuela, Ristani, for a very inspiring keynote, and also to show what one of our questions before, that yes, transformation can be done and accelerated if we are creative and innovative. And again, it proves that key elements towards a better city are actually also very advantageous and beneficial when a pandemic comes along, like happened in the couple of last months. We will jump straight into the panel debate because we have still extra panel members. And I quickly introduce them. It is Gertrude Shirambo. She's president of the Network of Elected Women Leaders in Malawi. And we have Jaya Dindau. She's director of urban development for the World Resource Institute in India. So Rajendra, first question, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elisa. It was such an educative experience, though we are crossing a little bit more time, but I believe it's worth extending the time and being with such a great leaders and such an innovative professional with us. I'll just set the very small rule for the panel discussion. We will have, though we were thinking to have a 40-minute panel, but I believe that we will limit to 20 to 25-minute panel. We have three main agendas to discuss. We will float the questions, and we will request all the speaker to reflect on the question one by one. I mean, we have three main key points. I'll introduce the first one, then followed by Elisabeth. She will discuss the remaining 2 points. My first question goes to Ms. Guterres from Malawi. And then after that, Jaya can reply and other speaker can reflect on. There is one word which has been very common in few days: new normal. I mean, this new normal, it is really a new normal, or it is a myth. As I said in the initial of the session, that 2020 had a lot of issues, but at least by end of 2020, the good news started coming. I mean, when I'm saying good news, I'm talking mainly about vaccine. I believe that 2021 is going to be at least for the year of vaccination to the globe. I'm assuming it. So coming back on the topic of a new normal, what do you think about? The globe has seen about many things which we were not expecting in the past, like what Madame Anuela has mentioned about is concert watching from balcony. I believe it started with Italy, about when all the balconies where people were doing a concert and playing. Our home have become office. We have seen how the offices has shifted to home, and this new word came, work from home. Offices have shifted to home. The global connect is become so normal. Right now, with today we are here we are connected with you. It's globally connected. So there had been a lot of things which has changed in last 6-7 months, let's say. So the term of new normal. I would request if you can just comment on this term called new normal, myth or reality. I request if Ms. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name. Elisa, you can help me. Ms.
Shirambu.
Ms. Girambu to start with, and then followed by Jaya. I request all the panelists if you can be very brief for your comment. Ms. Chirambo.
Thank you, Mr. Rajendra Kumar. Indeed, COVID has brought about a new normal way of living. I will just give an example in Malawi and regards with the presentations that we have had today. In Malawi, specifically in Blantyre, where I come from, which is a commercial capital, there is also a new normal of doing business in such that the way people travel, use public transport, there's been so many changes to be in line with COVID, such that businesses that run like small buses, they had to make adjustments to put in line with the social distancing rules. So like the new normal now in schools is that children have to make sure they wash their hands before they get in their classrooms. And the new normal now means that to us, for schools which didn't have access to safe drinking water, now it's a requirement that before they can reopen schools, they have to make sure that the place has got access to safe drinking water as well as washing water for improved sanitation. So the new normal also, as well as the digital aspects is concerned, is that now we can see more people are meeting more using the Zoom facilities and through the internet. So it has opened up our needs, like for counselors in Malawi, especially our network of women, that we really need like capacity building for us to partake of meetings of Zoom and through the internet. And also we have seen that there is much need for counselors in local government to have access to internet facilities, which is not the case in Malawi. Most counselors are in the rural areas and there are issues of internet connectivity. So with the coming of, with this COVID pandemic, it's been a necessity for us to make sure that we are upgraded in our equipment and to make sure that we have access to internet so that we can communicate despite the COVID restrictions.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I will, if you allow, can I go next, because we'll try to be a little bit brief. Can I okay. Request Jaya if you can comment, ma'am? I'll come back to you again.
All right. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Definitely. Let's rotate it. Jaya, are you around?
Yes, I'm here. I'm here, Rajendra.
Please, your reflection.
Yes, I think more than this being about a new normal, I think, what we have seen that this pandemic has had some adverse impacts on cities, on people, but on nature, it's been just the opposite because, the coronavirus sort of brought in the anthropause. So 2020 was not a lost year, really. It has been quite the opposite. So it depends upon, what viewpoint you take in viewing this whole situation. And when we're talking about the new normal, I think a lot of lessons have been learned and some realization has set in. So just to give a couple of examples, I mean, one is, we are more vulnerable and more at risk than we understood. And there's a stark division between the ones who have and those who don't, especially with access to public resources. So what we have to insist on, is not a new normal per se, but on resilient and inclusive recovery. The second thing is, how do we build cities, and that matters. Like, for example, someone mentioned density gained a bad reputation during this time. But really, I think mostly that was because we confused density with overcrowding. And, we need to make a distinction between the two. The third is, resilience is all about interdependency, and that is something that really came home. And a city or a town or people are only as resilient as its weakest link. So individual and community resilience and adaptive capacities are very, very important to cultivate. The fourth thing is that, we have to move towards more inclusionary plans and policies. This was very evident in a place like India, especially with the migrant workers, and, the way we saw the bottlenecks which were faced during the lockdowns and the supply chain logistics and so on and so forth. The fifth thing is, collaboration between stakeholders is very important for problem solving. So we cannot continue with the siloed approach. And so we have to find a way to work together. And there are many good examples of how this has happened. And lastly, I think, cities have been written off as, people will not return to the cities and that will never happen. But I think somewhere we're underestimating the resilience and the attraction of cities. And I think there will be a resurgence, but I think it's an opportunity for urban planners, for city leaders and policymakers to figure out how to kind of revert back, not to a new normal, but to a resilient and inclusive new recovery.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Jaya. I mean, I know this new normal. Who knows? Few years back, the new normal will be a normal. So yes, but I would just like to comment about this point about nature healing. This word which we have seen in last few months about how the whales were coming in Venice Sea and all those things were in the news few months back. But I will always say that nature healing is important, but a human life is more important. We are getting our nature healed, but at what cost? At the cost of a death of 1 million people. That will be always. That's my personal suggestion. I mean, personal observation. I believe that nature is for human, and human is for nature. So I will request if Herman and Antara would like to reflect on this, and before we finally go to Miss Anuela on the same point of new normal, myth or reality. Herman or Antara, you can choose who will speak first.
Thank you very much. I don't see Antara around, so I'll take the opportunity. I think really, I think this pandemic, as hard as it has been, and with some of the negative effects that it's had, it does point us towards a way of doing things differently. And I think it is an experience where people have ventured out and made use of certain facilities that they normally wouldn't use. And I think there's a shift in public perception of what is quality urban area, where do I want to live, how do I want to live, and what is it that is really important to us. And I think more and more you hear the quotes of people that there's a recognition that the way that we've urbanized, the way that we run economies and so forth, we're just using too many resources, right? We don't have to use all those resources. And there's a realization within people. And now the shift will start to happen. But I think it's the opportunity. It's also a once in a lifetime opportunity for governments to now take the initiative and to do that was done so well in Tirana, of saying, well, we're taking away the car space and we're giving it back to people. And it's a tough thing to do. And you do get pushback. But now, with the new reality that is there, we're able to actually do that because people have experienced it. And I think it is a move to greater sustainability. And it's not so much that there's these major changes and policy shifts that needs to happen. Most of these things that we are talking about now are within the Sustainable Development Goals and within the new urban agenda. It's just that we're at a point where we can take it seriously now, because we've seen the effect of if we don't do it and if we don't take care of the environment, what could happen to people and to cities. So I don't think the new normal is a myth. I think it is a shift in public perception and in public demand that will ultimately relate back to how we live and how we plan and develop cities, and in fact how we govern cities in terms of what is important.
Thank you so much, Herman. If Antara is around, I'm not very sure if she's there. Miss Anuela, would you like to comment on it before? Oh, Antara, you are here, please. I mean, I request you to be a bit brief, please.
I think I would second Herman on a lot of things. Yeah, it's just a need to act on what the SDGs already say. There's an urgency to now reinforce some principles that were always advocated. And yeah, this pandemic has shown that we're not as resilient as we had thought.
Thank you so much. I will request if Ms. Anuela can reflect on it before we go for next point.
The new normal for us was just an opportunity to confirm what we're doing was right. So it was that, I mean, it was so hard to pull people out of the cars, you know, out of their own willingness. It was so hard to explain them that you have to build bike lanes instead of parking lots. It was so hard to convince them that we have to plant trees, you know, and this is important. It's not just something that we're saying, you know, it's not something that the mayor wants to do for his own hobby. So for us, the new normal is being confirmed that what we were doing for the city in a systematic way is now pandemic proof, is now resilient, and does now make sense for the future. So that independently who runs the city or who's in charge, and I think that is true for countries as well, no matter who your politicians are, you now have a bar set that says, you know, if you want to be able to handle what comes along, you have to build neighborhoods that are mixed use and have enough space and have enough green space and have enough sustainable mobility. And these are not things that just one person believes or says. These are things for people to understand and to stay. I mean, as we speak, I'm sure most of us would basically be traveling the world throughout the year. And now we're stuck in our offices talking to whoever, you know, invites us to events. And it's very easy to attend. Well, before you had to schedule and you had to travel and you had to spend 2 days for one half-an-hour talk. You don't do that now. And this is here to stay. Out of all the possible conferences we would have, probably the new normal, we would have 10% of that left. The rest is going to be easily diluted in what we're doing right now. The same way it works for citizens. Out of everything that you're doing with your car, maybe just a fraction of that will still remain, but most of it, you know, maybe won't, because this was an example of showing that you could do it without the car. You could do it without, parking right there in the middle of the street next to your restaurant. So to us, the new normal is finally a new understanding between what is good policy making in urban development and what is the sense of community and the sense of participating citizens.
Thank you so much. I mean, since you have shown that the path that, you know, nothing is impossible, and the initiative what you have done before pandemic also, and as you rightly said, that it has been proven that you were doing right. I mean, it's a great move. It's a great example for all global cities to learn. Now I will request Elisabeth to raise 2 points. I believe that we were thinking to have a 3-point together, but I will request if Elisa can speak about, give a background about invisible impact and post-COVID together, just for interest of time. Elisa, please.
Yes, okay. So we heard already about the impact and some of the emergent lessons of pandemics. And we've seen around the world too that many cities took action and tactical urbanism projects to experiment, especially in streets and bike lanes, etc. So the question is also, is this temporary or will this really be a major change? We know that pollution decreased in some cities and some cities saw blue sky for the first time. Although we know too in a recent report that the pollution is actually increasing also this year, despite the big drop in the pandemic period. We have seen that some inequities have been revealed, but other ones the inequities have been much stronger than before, and some setbacks. And I'm thinking of gender issues and specific needs of women. We've also discovered, all of us, the value of the neighborhood, our street, and also the value of nature because we miss it. But there are also aspects like young people, and the very young people that have been left on the background. There was more attention on the elderly. But the young people were actually even falling through the cracks of planning and management before the pandemic, perhaps even more so. So I would like to know what are some of the invisible impacts, if you think a little bit deeper in your cities, and then how can we move forward to post-COVID urbanism, as some use the word, or simply moving forward to better cities, and what should be or could be then the priority for, at one hand, for policymakers or governments, and for planners, each in your roles. So I don't know who wants to take the floor, Gertrude. And maybe for you, I will connect this with a question which came here from UCLG. How can we take into account?
Sorry if I'm interrupting. Miss Anuela has to leave. She so if she can just comment and then leave, because if you see her message in the chat box, ma'am, you just comment and then you can leave.
Sorry, I had this scheduled until 5:45, and that's why I apologize. I wouldn't want to leave otherwise, but it's another engagement. I believe that the gender roles and this whole emphasis that we have in having women involved, it wasn't so straightforward before. We could see how it is now. And I think it's not just true for COVID, it's true for green cities, it's true for sustainability, and it's true for all long-term thinking in general when we plan. And I think it's one of these new trends which I'm following very closely right now is how you plan for a gender neutral city. We haven't, and when I said before, we've designed cities for active people, I should have mentioned we've designed cities for male active people. And that has been, you know, the mainstream concept of urban development in the last decades, because you're thinking of the guy who's active, who's going to work, who gets stuff done, doesn't have the kids with him to take them to school because it's, you know, the mother doing that. So this is the mindset of, you know, how we've been planning the cities. And now it turns out it doesn't work. It does not work because, you know, it's not just the dad who goes and pays the bills. It's they have to drop the kids either way, you know, one or the other. And it doesn't work with one salary. And it doesn't work that the mom doesn't have the access and the capabilities to use the city the same way, you know, the dad does, and so on and so forth. So, you know, it's not necessarily a gender issue, but it's a democratic issue. And it's the same concept of me mentioning before, we plan cities for the ones who own this metallic box, and that's not the democratic way of planning cities. We design cities for the male citizen, and that's not the democratic way of planning cities either. So it's not, I do not see it as a feminist issue. I just see it as a common sense issue. And it turns out to be a common sense issue and not a women's rights issue overall. But that was, and I don't know if this was extreme, but that's my really energetic take on this topic. And I really firmly believe that that's the case.
Thank you so much for, on this note, if you have to leave, I mean, I would really like to thank on behalf of ISOCARP, UN Habitat, and everybody. It was such a wonderful listening you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was such a pleasure for me meeting all of you guys. I hope to meet you again soon.
Yes, thank you very much.
So much for having me.
Other one can reply. Yeah,
so perhaps we can get a reflection from Gertrude on this topic, Gertrude.
Yeah, is she around?
Muted, yes. Gertrude?
Yes, thank you, Elisabeth. On reflection, I'll still go back to this experience in Malawi, that we have been so lucky in that during this COVID, there's been only like 6,000 cases and less than 200 deaths. And at the moment, we are recording less than 10 cases a day for COVID infections. I just want to also say that this has, as I was reflecting on the aspect of women, it has shown that we have a report by the Ministry of Gender on women that during this COVID season, about 12,000 teenagers have been impregnated. And also we have 400 girls who are in underage marriages in the 5 districts of Malawi. So it has shown that during this COVID period, we really need to have adequate facilities for recreation for young women and girls, and also to keep them occupied apart from learning environment, so that they can have other extracurricular activities. Because if we had good infrastructure and a vibrant program for young women and girls, I'm sure that we wouldn't have lost 12,000 girls, because that will go into our future, our next generation. That number is so huge. Malawi is such a small country. So on reflecting, it has been an eye-opener to say that when we are making policies for planning for our cities as well as our towns, or even in the rural areas, we need to take into account the, that 15-minute rule, to say that maybe within 15 minutes, you should have access to the basic facilities that the people need. And it has shown also that access to water has a big bearing on the outcomes of the girl child, as far as access to enabling them to have education as well is concerned. Because on reflection, a lot of young girls and women, they travel long distances to access water. And during this COVID season, it has been seen that a lot of girls will not be able to go to school if their schools were not having the access to water. And it goes down also to the poverty levels and also the cultural aspects. So this COVID season has shown us that we really need to work on the girl child, because if the girl is left behind, then the whole society will be left behind. So that is what I can say as far as lessons that we have learned on the gender aspect of as far as Malawi case study is concerned.
Yes, thank you.
I don't know if there are any questions, but I just thought I should share on the statistics that we have for the young girls that are now out of school because of this during this COVID pandemic.
Thank you, Gertrude.
Over to you, Elisabeth.
Yes, thank you so much. I'll give the Jaya. Do you want to reflect on this?
Yes, I think a couple of things in terms of the question you asked about, the invisible sort of impacts. So on one hand, I think we have cities like Tirana and many others, and even in some of the Indian cities where, they've been bike lanes, public spaces have been opened up, and there has been an increase in the use of, these kind of facilities. But on the other hand, there has been an increase in car use, and there has been an increase in car purchases in many Indian cities, for example, because, now people are not using public transport as much. But I think one of the things, or one of the shifts that has happened is in terms of, just people's consciousness. And I think this has happened for various stakeholders. So whether you're talking about government, whether you're talking about people, there are a couple of shifts which has happened. And there are many cities who have, displayed examples of how they have kind of move to certain things, and I'll just talk about a couple of examples. So one is that we've realized that urban planning so far, as far as Indian cities are concerned, has been a reactive process. And we've been using the tools from the past century to address issues and problems of the present century, and that's been a huge problem. And so I think some of the realization that has happened and how cities are responding is that they've learned that they need to be more collaborative, agile, and flexible in their policies and plans that they're putting out, and that needs to happen. The second thing that the realization that has come about, or the shift that is happening, is that you have to invest in sustainable and resilient infrastructure. So the conversation has to move beyond sustainability to resiliency. And I think some of the numbers that some of our studies have brought forth make a huge impact. For example, every dollar that is invested in resilience yields to about a $2 to $10 increment in terms of the returns that you get. And city leaders are seeing that, and they're understanding that for cities which are primarily labor markets, you have to recognize that you have to create this functional, unfragmented area, and you have to invest in resilient infrastructure to be able to do that. The third thing is that, addressing governance and financing gaps. How do you do that in cities now, and especially in central business districts, which, a lot of the jobs are now working from home and all of that. So what you have to do is find a way to attract talent again, attract businesses again, And you have to create these livable neighborhoods, which are key to, attracting these kind of labor and talent. And, with that, the value of places increases, and, that brings better revenues for cities. And then, those are ways in which you need to look at some of the governance and financing gaps. The fourth thing is that, change and shifts in behaviors. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, but there have been shifts, and a lot of them from the corporate side, for example, have been positive. And they're looking at, how do you build or move towards a more resource, secure future? And, how do you do that through sort of circular economy approaches in the production and goods and in the consumption of services? How do you kind of move towards that? And I think lastly, one of the things which is also emerging is that you have to partner with ecosystem stakeholders to mainstream innovation, which is happening in the private sector for public good. So when you talk about, for example, PPPs, you don't only invite the private sector into the public domain for their resources, but also for their ideas and also for the solutioning that they bring. And for that, the procurement processes, some of these things, small things that need to be improved in the ecosystem. And the COVID response has shown that it is possible to overcome long, tenuous procurement processes to make sure that all the stakeholders are working together and that there is solutioning happening for the city. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Jaya. Any comments you'd like to add, Herman, Antara?
Maybe just a very quick comment on my part about the invisible impacts. And I think the issue around systemic poverty that are within urban areas, it's almost as if we got desensitized about that, and it became an acceptable norm within cities, and there's growing poverty. And I think the whole pandemic has sort of uncovered that to an extent, to say, well, it's actually not something that because you think you can survive with it, that one doesn't have to deal with it. And I think it has put renewed emphasis on this whole issue of dealing with poverty, because a lot of these unseen impacts, as has been highlighted by Gertrude as well, is the underlying problem is poverty, that then give rise to a whole range of social ills that has been exacerbated within the time of the pandemic as well. And I think this is a government responsibility, really, and a global responsibility to say we can't just accept this. We need to start to deal with this in a way to turn it around and to make these areas also economically resilient for future development. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.
Antara?
Yes, past 6 o'clock, so I think we will finish the debate, but I like a quick round, and it's a difficult one, but a quick round on each of you, if there were one priority that we should focus on, within your field, governmental or as a planner, what should it be?
Just 2 words. Just 2 words.
Just a sentence or two.
We start with the Antara this time because Antara couldn't. So we start with Antara now. Antara?
Okay. I would say reduce inequality. I think that has been exposed and will continue to haunt us if we don't tackle it right away. There's a lot of concentration of wealth in a few hands, and large sections of the community are getting neglected, adversely impacted economically, socially.
Antara, we got it. A reduced poverty. I believe it is one of the sustainable
inequality.
Yes. So next to, let's say, Ms. Chiramoto, just Chirambo, Ms. Chirambo.
Thank you. Yeah, the word that I have, yes, it's a holistic approach. Holistic approach to planning. Holistic approach.
Okay, holistic approach for planning. Herman?
I'm going for public space and regaining the majority of open space and roads for public.
Public space, definitely very, very, very valid point. Now we have, Jaya, yes.
I would say, harness the power of technology, of data to build resilient cities and to build inclusive cities.
Harness power of technology, you said.
Technology and data, yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because at this time, I believe that, in this, we started with the term called new normal. And new normal in this case, maximum the contribution goes to the innovation in information technology. The IT has played a very silent role, but a very, very major role. I believe with this note, I would like to conclude our session. We had such a wonderful session. I am extremely sorry for all the audiences who are writing the question, especially Ursula and other. I'll just read out. I'm sure that we don't have a time for answering the question. Planning for gender-friendly cities, accommodate gender neutralities, binaries and fluidity inclusive of all gender. That's a good comment. It's a comment. I'll not take a question. So it was such a wonderful and very engaging session with all the speakers, with all the audiences. We have people watching us live from YouTube. Though we crossed 40 minutes beyond our scheduled time, but still people are patiently listening. Thank you so much to all the speakers, Madam Chimbado, Jaya, Jaya, we have Boeri, he left, Herman, and Antara. Thank you so much. So over to you, Elisabeth, for final comment.
Yes, Rajendra, I will ask you too, what would be your word to sum up?
My word is opposite to one of the speakers said that we should think Corona as a natural healing, let's say, event. No, I absolutely not in the favor of Corona taking as a nature feeling. I will always say that human first. When I'm saying human, I'm also including animal also. It's not anything nature, it's for this thing. So we should prioritize the human in the center, as we have seen the example of Tirana and all. So prioritizing the human in the center, that is thing. That's my point.
Okay, thank you so much. So we have reducing inequality, a holistic approach to planning, regaining public space for the public, tech and data, the human or the living in the center. And I will add to this cross-sector collaboration, interdisciplinary collaboration. It's also something which was mentioned by, I think, many speakers. And this is also why we invited different profiles in this debate, because I think that's the way forward for the next decade. Thank you so much to all the speakers, to the audience for being so patient and listening.
Tomorrow also, we have a very, very useful session with the keynote by a professor from Columbia University, and then set of very interesting papers. So do join us tomorrow also. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
It's been a
everyone.
pleasure.